You're going to get your little thumbs up that you're okay with it. And then here we go. So welcome to Snake River Savers Week of Action. Today we have a guest speaker that we are very happy to have today, and her name is Monica Wieland Shields, and she is a recognized wildlife photographer, an author, and a field biologist who lives on San Juan Island. She is co-founder of the nonprofit research group, the Orca Behavior Institute, and she is author of Orca Encounters, Images of Southern Resident Killer Whales, and the book Endangered Orcas. So I'd like to welcome Monica.
Yeah, thank you guys for joining me tonight. I thought I would just kind of give a general overview of the two populations of orcas that we have here in the Salish Sea, focusing in, of course, on the endangered southern residents, and also talking about how the Snake River dams relate to the southern resident killer whales. So I've been watching whales up here in the San Juan Islands for, it's hard to believe, but 20 years now. I started I've had a lifelong love for orcas, but when we came on a family vacation to the San Juan Islands when I was a high school student, and I saw the southern residents for the first time out at Lime Kiln on the west side of San Juan Island, it was love at first sight, and kind of everything that's happened for me since then has been driven by my love for the orcas. And I interned as a high school student at the Whale Museum here on San Juan Island and got experience making hydrophone recordings and collecting behavioral data on the whales. I completed my undergraduate degree at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, where I grew up, and got a degree in biology there, and then moved to San Juan Island full time after graduating. And I've kind of worn a lot of different hats in the whale community. I've done wildlife photography and blogging and writing. I published a couple books and worked as a naturalist on a whale watching boat. And then most recently was a co-founder of the Orca Behavior Institute, which is a nonprofit group that we started in 2015 with the mission of conducting non-invasive behavioral and acoustic research on orcas of the Salish Sea. And one of our motivating questions was really driven by the changes that if we had been seeing, those of us that have been watching the whales here on San Juan Island. So I'm actually watching whales from shore on San Juan Island. I'm in both these pictures right here. And the one on the left is from one of the years I was interning out at Lime Kiln, and that's J-Pod passing right off the rocks at Lime Kiln. On the right is a photo taken just a couple of years ago of big killer whales, or mammal-eating transient killer whales, they're also called, right off the other side of the island at Reuben Tart County Park. And I really like these two photos because they really demonstrate what has changed. That the first few years I was here, I watched exclusively southern resident killer whales from shore. And I was actually here for 4 summers before even seeing a Biggs killer whale. Now that's changed dramatically, where Biggs killer whales are here a lot and the southern residents have become really scarce. And last season, we actually encountered Biggs killer whales 4 times as often as we did southern resident killer whales. And so the motivation for starting the Orca Behavior Institute was to try and put some data behind these trends we were seeing, that the southern residents were changing their patterns. They were abandoning what used to be kind of their core summer habitat here in the Salish Sea. And then we're seeing this huge influx of the Biggs killer whales. Their population is growing. They're spending a lot more time here. They're here in bigger groups. And we wanted to document some of these behavioral changes that we were seeing and to get that out in the scientific literature. To help inform policy, because if we want to protect, these killer whales and help the southern residents recover, we need to have good data showing not only what the whales have done in the past, which is hugely important, but also what they're doing now. And so we formed primarily as a research organization, but really with that comes the education and advocacy, where, we need to share what we've learned about the whales and provide, we provide internships to get students field experience. I give talks like this one as part of our education programs. And then we also advocate based on the science that we and others have done for science-based policy to protect the whales and the ecosystem that they depend on. So if you don't already follow us on social media, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and SoundCloud, where we're always posting updates on our work, photos from our whale encounters, acoustic recordings, all kinds of stuff. So just to give you a little bit of background on who I am and the work that I'm currently doing. But here in the Salish Sea, we have two what are called ecotypes of killer whales. So killer whales as a species are still considered a single species all throughout the world. And they're one of the most widespread mammals on the planet, found in every ocean of the world. But for now, they're all considered Orcinus orca. But everywhere you find them, you find populations that are specialized to feed on what's available in that particular area, and unique cultures, really, of killer whales. So they may have overlapping geographic ranges, or they may, share diet with some of the other populations of orcas that occur elsewhere in the world. But really everything else about each population of orcas is distinct. And here in the inland waters of Washington, that's primarily the resident killer whale, the fish eaters, and the bigs or transient killer whales, the mammal eaters. And so while they are considered the same species for now, we really call them different ecotypes to differentiate, to indicate just how different these two populations really are. So morphologically, at first glance, they look pretty similar, but there are some differences between them. Resident killer whales are smaller. They have rounder dorsal fins, and they can have open saddle patches. Bigs killer whales are bigger with more triangular fins and solid saddle patches. Their genetics are different because they have not interbred with one another for many thousands of years, even though they live in the same geographic area. As I mentioned, their diet is different, with the residents being fish eaters and the bigs killer whales being mammal eaters. They have different acoustic repertoires. The way that they behave and travel through their environment is different. And even their social structure is different, with southern residents not having any dispersal from their natal family groups, whereas bigs killer whales tend to be in smaller groups of maybe 3 to 6 animals, with males and females sometimes dispersing from their natal group. So really it's really unusual to have two populations of the same species in the same geographic area that don't interact or interbreed with one another. But that's what we have with the resident killer whales and the bigs killer whales. And really that all comes from their diet. That's sort of the basis of who they are, and everything that follows about how they behave, how they travel, how they socialize, it all comes back to what they eat. So for the marine mammal eaters, this chart shows what it is that they're eating. So more than 50% of their diet is harbor seals, but they're also eating harbor porpoise, stellar sea lions, and Dall's porpoise, and then a variety of other marine mammal species make up the rest of their diet. And because these guys are hunting marine mammals, they tend to be in smaller social groups because if they were, in larger groups, they're easier to detect and their prey would, know that they're around and get out of there. They tend to be very stealthy, often quiet, not very surface active, sometimes going on long dives, and they kind of go in and out of every little cove and inlet, zigging and zagging as they're traveling throughout their environment. And again, all these sort of behavioral characteristics kind of come back to the fact that they're after mammals. So they are in smaller groups, they're quieter, they're stealthy, and they're kind of zigzagging through their environment as they search for marine mammals. Now with the southern residents, it's completely different. They tend to be in these large gregarious groups. They're super chatty, super vocal underwater, tend to be very surface active. And again, they can afford to do this because the salmon that they're after historically were very abundant, and also not as aware of their surroundings as a harbor seal or a porpoise. So the whales can be surface active, super vocal, and can still successfully hunt their prey. And they can also be in large groups. Historically, we would have anywhere from 20 southern residents at a time, all the way up to the entire population of 80 or 90 individuals that could all travel together here in the inland waters and find abundant salmon to feast on here. So in the Salish Sea, this is kind of considered the southern residents' core summer habitat from May through September. And what they're eating when they're here is predominantly Chinook salmon, although they do eat a couple other of salmonid species as well. But really what they were feasting on in those summer months is salmon returning to the Fraser River near Vancouver, BC. When they're on the outer coast, so the southern residents range from kind of central BC down to central California. And they can be found anywhere throughout that range at any time of year. But historically, the pattern was that they would be here for much of the spring, summer, and fall, and then they would be on the outer coast in the winter and the early spring. And for many years, it really wasn't known what they were eating out there. But just last year, a study was published by NOAA after collecting a lot of prey and fecal samples from the whales on the outer coast. And not too surprising, their diet there, as indicated on the right pie chart here, shows that they're also eating predominantly Chinook on the outer coast, but also lingcod, steelhead, halibut. So some non-salmon species are coming in there. But really, the take-home message here is that these whales depend really strongly on Chinook salmon, and that's true year-round, even though other species like coho, steelhead, chum play an importance through different seasons and certain locations. Really, the majority of their diet is Chinook salmon year-round. And because they range from central BC to central California, they're relying on those Chinook salmon runs throughout that entire range as well. And so historically, that was primarily the Fraser River in BC, the Columbia Snake River Basin in Oregon and Washington, and then the Klamath River Basin in California. So we have these two different populations here that are feeding on two different things. And I mentioned at the beginning that we've seen this dramatic shift in their presence here in the inland waters. So this chart is looking at the number of days both ecotypes of whales were present in the Salish Sea from April through September. And this is looking at a time from 2005 all the way through last year from 2021. So looking first at southern resident killer whales, you can see that it was really common for the whales over the summer period to be present about 130 days. And that is a trend that goes back to when studies began in kind of the early 1970s. But 2013 is the year where things really started to change, where all of a sudden the whales weren't here in the summer the way that they used to be. And we, had a few years after that things seemed a little more normal again. They were here more regularly, but you can see that since 2016 or so, there's just been this steady decline in the amount of time that the southern residents are spending here during the summer. Now, looking in the red line here at big killer whales, you can see the pattern is almost completely flipped. We used to only have them here in the area for about 30 days in that April through September period. Now that has steadily increased to 180 days plus, or almost every single day from April through September. So there's just been this dramatic shift of southern residents declining and big killer whales increasing over the last few years. So what's going on? Why are we seeing this dramatic change? Well, one way of looking at big killer whale presence here is through what's called an occurrence. And essentially that's not just looking at sightings of whales, but looking at how many groups are coming in, how often into the Salish Sea. So just because they're a little bit more difficult to detect, there's been this, several studies have used this definition of an occurrence to see how often big killer whales are here in inland waters. And you can see that using occurrences, this trend that comes from 3 different publications that looked at 3 7-year periods, shows this steady increase over time of how many occurrences are happening here in the Salish Sea. And if we overlap that with one indicator of abundance of prey for Bigg's killer whales. So the second line here is harbor porpoise abundance in inland waters. You can see that there's this amazing correlation with recovery of harbor porpoise populations and increase of Bigg's killer whales being here. And it's not too surprising. So in the 1970s, the Marine Mammal Protection Act went into effect, providing protection for all marine mammal species, but especially species that were being either hunted or being caught as bycatch. And so the harbor porpoise, Dall's porpoise, harbor seals, stellar sea lions that the Bigg's killer whales are relying on suddenly got this protection. Those populations began to recover here in Washington, and the Bigg's killer whales began to recover right alongside them. As their prey became more abundant, they became more present here, which is not a surprising correlation. Looking at the southern residents, we see the reverse trend. So this is looking at Fraser River Chinook salmon, and there's a test catch fishery near the mouth of the Fraser River in Vancouver, BC, that's essentially looking at how many fish are returning to the river. They do daily catches throughout the spring and summer, and they've been doing this for several decades. So we have this incredible data set. And what's going to be shown here is kind of what the test catch numbers are like. First here is May in green, and you can see that numbers are pretty low, but that they've declined to almost zero in recent years. Here is June. On top of that, you can see again, bigger spikes earlier on, but declining in recent years. July, same trend. August, same trend. So you can see that cumulatively, we used to have a lot of Chinook salmon returning to the Fraser River in May through August, and that's declined to just a fraction of what it used to be in recent years. And so if we put the number of days southern residents have been present over that, again, not surprising that we see this sort of decline over time in response to the decline of their prey source. So there's undoubtedly some other factors, at play determining where the whales travel and when they travel there. But really the take-home message is that the primary driver of where both these populations of killer whales show up has to do with how much food is available for them. So with abundant marine mammals here in the Salish Sea, we have an abundance of Bigg's killer whales. And with the dramatic declines of Fraser River Chinook salmon, we've seen the southern residents almost abandon what used to be their core summer habitat. So it's really, fortunate because we have this amazing story to tell looking at one habitat here in the Salish Sea, two populations of orcas, and then the three risk factors that have been identified as kind of the primary risks that these both populations face. So we talked about prey, the abundance of prey is one important consideration when we look at how healthy our killer whales are. We look at vessel effects, how much underwater noise is being put into the water by things from, shipping traffic, ferries, things like that. Also military exercises, small vessels. There's, a variety of noise and disturbance related concerns that both populations are exposed to. And finally, there's contaminants, which are commonly things like PCBs or PBDEs that are in the marine environment. And these bioaccumulating toxins kind of work their way up the food chain. And so we see those toxins in both populations of orcas as well. And actually, transient killer whales actually have even higher toxin levels than the southern residents because they're kind of one step higher up the food chain. So southern residents are feeding on salmon. The transient killer whales are feeding on seals and porpoises that are feeding on salmon and other fish species. So the Bigg's killer whales have even higher toxin levels than the southern residents. So again, you have these two populations exposed to the same contaminants in the environment. They're exposed to the same vessel effects, but really the big difference is the amount of prey that's available to these two populations of whales. And that's why we're seeing one population thriving and one population really struggling. So I want to take a closer look at what's going on specifically with the southern residents. So as I mentioned, they're relying on salmon that return to BC, Washington, Oregon, and California. And this is a chart that just shows the salmon declines that have occurred pretty much across the entire Pacific coast. You can see the historic salmon returns in dark blue, and then the salmon returns as of 2012 in orange there. And while all the rivers have declined, you can see that the Columbia Snake River Basin was by far the dominant Chinook salmon river on the West Coast, at least this far south, with absolutely huge salmon runs, over 4 million fish returning historically. And there's been this just huge decline to less than 500,000 fish. And because of that, in the Southern Resident Killer Whale Recovery Plan that was developed after the endangered listing of the southern residents in 2005, NOAA says in their recovery plan that perhaps the single greatest change in food availability for resident killer whales since the late 1800s has been the decline of salmon from the Columbia River Basin. So that really underscores, the importance of the changes that have happened on the Columbia River to the southern resident killer whales. And one thing that we hear a lot is like, oh, the whales are in the Salish Sea, so why does what's happening on the Columbia River affect them? But there's really, it's a bigger picture than that, where the whales are not just here in the Salish Sea. These are really West Coast killer whales that range from Canada down to California, and they're relying on salmon all throughout that range. And then the salmon themselves are super mobile as well. So when fish leave the Columbia River, they kind of turn right, they head up towards Alaska, where they spend several years before they return to spawn back to the Columbia River. So even if the whales aren't encountering them right off the mouth of the Columbia River, they could be easily encountering them on the outer coast up here as those salmon are migrating to and from their spawning grounds. So it's, I really want to underscore that the Fraser River is hugely important to the southern residents in terms of their summer, history of what they used to do and come feast here in the Salish Sea. So the decline of the whales spending time in the Salish Sea really relates to the Fraser River. But looking at their population as a whole and Chinook salmon abundance as a whole, we really see the importance of the Columbia Snake River Basin as well to the southern resident killer whales. So we've had these huge declines in prey availability, and what can be done? What can we do about that? And I always remind people that if salmon recovery were easy, we would have done it by now. But unfortunately, it's a very complicated issue, because here we have these fish that range from freshwater tributaries down through major rivers out into the open ocean. So they're traversing this, greatly diverse habitat from freshwater to estuaries to saltwater and back again. They cover, such a huge geographic area throughout the course of their lifetime that they're transiting through different states and provinces, different countries. And there's just so many jurisdictions that have a stake in where these fish travel, whether it's local governments or state or provincial governments. There's international governing bodies for fisheries. There's different tribal territories. So when you're talking about a fish that covers this huge geographic area, it's very difficult to get everybody on the same page, because they rely on a healthy habitat over such a great region that one weak link in that area that they traverse can mean that they don't do well. And really, Chinook salmon on the West Coast are kind of experiencing death by 1,000 cuts, because there are so many issues that they face, and often they're different from river system to river system. In the Columbia and Snake Rivers, the dams are one of the major issues that are impeding fish from returning in levels that they used to. But on the Fraser River, there aren't any dams. Up there in BC, we have salmon runs swimming through, aquaculture and in water fish farms that are introducing disease to the salmon populations. Up in Alaska, we have, fisheries that are mixed stock, where they're harvesting from sustainable Alaskan fisheries runs, but they're also harvesting from endangered salmon runs from here in the lower 48. In some places, logging and development are issues. So there's just so many things that salmon are facing, and really we need to figure out how to tackle some of these big ticket items to really ensure the recovery of Chinook salmon coastwide and the survival of southern resident killer whales. And so that means having these difficult conversations about how to breach specific dams that would give us kind of the bang for our buck. We're not advocating for taking all dams out. We need hydroelectricity, we need dams for navigation and irrigation, but there are some dams where their use has become more obsolete, and we might be able to open up, great spawning habitat for salmon. We need to talk about fisheries quotas and how those are designated. There's been discussion of actually giving the southern residents sort of an official piece of the pie when fisheries are being designated. So potentially setting aside, a portion of salmon runs for the southern residents, as well as the other, those that have rights to fish, whether it's the tribes or recreational or commercial fishermen. I mentioned in BC, the process of removing fish farms, and then habitat restoration, which can be done on a very local scale, or we can talk about it on a very broad scale with things like climate change and ocean acidification. So there's, kind of a wide variety of issues that the whales and the fish are facing. And we need to have these discussions both, kind of at a local level in our communities anywhere from BC to California, but also as an entire region to ensure that wild Pacific salmon continue to thrive into the future and that the southern residents have a chance to survive as well. But let's look a little bit more specifically at the Snake River and its importance to the southern resident killer whales. So on the left here is a graphic that shows all the different river basins that prey samples have come from for southern residents. So all those northern river tributaries that are kind of in pale green, those are all the tributaries that make up the majority of the summer prey samples that were taken here in the Salish Sea. And those are all from the Fraser River and the Fraser River's main tributary, the Thompson River. So again, in the summer, when the whales are in the Salish Sea, they've historically relied on the Fraser River basin. But on the outer coast, those darker green regions on the map there represent what the whales are feeding on in the October through May season when they're on the outer coast. And that's where you see the Columbia Snake Basin and the Klamath River Basin. So we know from both prey and fecal samples that the whales are relying on fish that are returning to these river systems. But we've also seen through NOAA's satellite tagging efforts that occurred, between 5 and 10 years ago, that the whales themselves are spending a lot of time near the mouth of the Columbia River as well, in kind of the late winter, early spring. So among the southern residents, there are 3 pods: J pod, K pod, and L pod. And they all have kind of their own unique pattern in terms of how they spend the year. So we often see all 3 pods come together, but in general, J pod is sort of the most resident of the 3 pods, in that they spend the majority of the year in the inland waters here in the Salish Sea. K and L pods typically come in the summer and fall and spend the winter and spring on the outer coast. So in fact, J pod has not been seen down in Oregon and California. It's just K and L pods that are down there. So this satellite tag was a winter tag in 2015 on L84. And you can see that he just went back and forth with members of his pod right off the mouth of the Columbia River there between Oregon and Washington. So in addition to the prey samples showing that whales are relying on fish returning to this river, just the physical presence of K and L pods regularly in the winter and early spring right off the mouth of the Columbia is additional evidence that they're foraging on fish that are returning to those areas. So from the satellite tags, we saw that both K and L pods spend a lot of time this time of year, actually, February and March especially, right off the mouth of the Columbia River. And this is when the spring Chinook are returning to spawn. And these are the biggest Chinook salmon that travel the furthest up the river basin and kind of enter the river earliest in the season. And so it's not a surprise that that's when the whales are choosing to hang out there, when they would typically encounter these fish as they're preparing to spawn up in the river. So you can see in the final picture here on the right where the lower Snake River dams are. And so they're pretty much, the furthest up the river. So these fish that the whales are encountering right now, probably off the mouth of the Columbia, will make this long journey all the way up the Columbia and then divert up into the Snake. And the reason that the Snake River dams are of such importance is because they sort of meet that criteria of not being hugely important in terms of the function that they're still providing, and also blocking off this huge region of fairly pristine, high elevation salmon spawning habitat. So, some of the other dams further down on the Columbia River, the Bonneville Dam, the John Day Dam, these are ones that are still really important regionally for providing electricity, for navigation and things like that. Removing those would be, have a much greater impact on human society, that we still are depending on these dams. But the 4 lower Snake River dams were primarily put in for navigation. And basically they make the town of Lewiston, Idaho, a port city by allowing, agricultural products to be shipped out to sea from Lewiston, Idaho. But there's great potential to replace the function that these dams have through other means. There's a railway that follows the river that could be used for transportation. There's solar and wind power opportunities that can replace the hydroelectricity provided by these dams. So it's this combination of factors that has led to these 4 dams being such a key part of the conversation, because there are hundreds of dams, throughout the country, but these dams have been identified as potentially providing kind of the most bang for our buck in terms of opening up huge salmon spawning grounds that could really help Columbia Snake River salmon recover. We know that these are runs that were historically very important to southern resident killer whales. And we know that the mitigation, what we can do to replace the functions that these dams are serving is something attainable. It's something that we can do. So that's why so much of the discussion has been focused on the Snake River. And in fact, there's been efforts and discussions about breaching the 4 lower Snake River dams going back to the late 1990s, when Snake River salmon were first listed as endangered. So again, if this is something that we've known about for several decades, why haven't we done it yet? Well, just like with salmon recovery in general, something as big as big of an undertaking as breaching these federally operated dams is incredibly complex, very controversial, and complicated. So there's movement towards this happening, but because of the complexity of the situation, that's why it hasn't happened yet. And while salmon advocates have been arguing for the breaching of the 4 lower Snake River dams for several decades, kind of the southern resident killer whale component is still relatively new, maybe over the last 10 years or so, where the importance of these fish to the southern residents has kind of become more broadly known. And that connection between what used to be thought of as kind of Salish Sea killer whales to this river system that's really inland in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, that connection has been made, and people are realizing now that it's not just for salmon, but it's for killer whales that we should breach these dams. And that has kind of increased the public outcry for something to be done. So I just want to go through a couple points about the Snake River dams and maybe some common kind of, misconceptions. There's for example, who can breach the dams? I've heard that a lot of people call on Governor Jay Inslee to breach the dams. But these dams are actually operated by the Army Corps of Engineers, which is a federal agency. So any decision to breach or remove these dams has to be done at the federal level. But the reason that the state governments and state legislatures are so important in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho is that this is really where the political support needs to be generated, is among these regional politicians. So the governors of the states, the state senators and representatives, and the state governments as well, if they are willing to come out in support of this issue, that will provide a lot of the kind of political cover for the federal agencies to make this important decision. But if the regional politicians don't even support breaching the dams, then there's no way that the federal agencies can come in and make this kind of decision. So that's why we put so much pressure on our local government officials. But it's important to know that the governors of these states can't actually make the decision to breach the dams. That has to come at the federal level. Why does this process take so long? As I mentioned, it's incredibly politically complicated, just like the salmon that traverse so many different kind of government jurisdictions, the dams really do as well. There's different state and federal agencies as well as tribes involved in the process. You know, it's kind of an issue that addresses 3 states and many tribes, and then all the different local jurisdictions, plus all of the different stakeholder groups that have an interest in these dams, some of which have been lobbying very strongly against dam breaching and putting a lot of money into those arguments over the past several decades, making sort of that generation of political will a very slow process. But it's important to know too that there are real people that depend on these dams still for irrigation, for navigation, for hydroelectricity. And so it's really important that a fair mitigation plan is developed that will make sure that we're putting something in place that will replace the services that these dams are having for the people that do still depend on them. As I've really seen, you know, here in Washington, a lot of times it kind of gets it becomes a really divisive issue where we have, oh, the environmentalists in Western Washington against the farmers in Eastern Washington. And really, to move forward, we need to recognize that we all want the same thing. We all want healthy salmon runs. We all want sustainable farms in our state and a healthy economy. And to do that, we need to breach the dams, but we need to, alongside that, develop a plan that will support our farmers and will support the communities that have relied on these dams for many decades. And it's by finding the ways to have those conversations and bring communities together that will move this issue forward, rather than pointing fingers and continuing the divides that have kept us in kind of the gridlock that we've been in for so long. And the good news is that there is progress being made. In February of 2021, an Idaho Republican congressman became the first kind of major elected official to publicly support breaching the 4 lower Snake River dams for the purpose of salmon recovery. And he proposed a plan on when and how to do so that has really kind of brought conversations to the next level. In October of 2021, Washington's Governor Inslee and Senator Murray announced a process to develop a mitigation plan in the event of federal dam breaching. And this was, while of course we want this process to move forward more quickly, this was a huge step forward in that it was the first time that Inslee and Murray really acknowledged that breaching the Snake River dams was a legitimate possibility, that it was an important option to consider, and that we needed to have a plan at the Washington state level in place to make sure that it was fair to farmers and other interest groups in the event that the dam breaching process does begin. So they started that process last October and plan to kind of have the research portion of that complete by July. And that will essentially have this, help the state be prepared to know what needs to be done to make it fair for all the communities impacted by eventual dam breaching. And And so in honor of that process going on and in recognition of the importance of that process, the active lawsuits that are in place that have been litigating the impact of hydropower on wild salmon runs have been put on hold until July of this year, when that process is complete. So basically, since the salmon in the Columbian Snake River have been listed as endangered, the salmon recovery plans have been in court since then because they have not taken sufficient action to address the impacts of hydropower, specifically the dams, on these fish. So the latest round of lawsuits is, still ongoing, but on hold kind of until the end of this process. And so we're all really kind of hopeful that once this sort of mitigation plan at the state level is produced, that will put even more pressure on the federal agencies to move forward the dam breaching process, because that's really what the lawsuits have shown time and time again, is that breaching the dams is really the best consideration, the best option that will recover these fish. But in the meantime, as I mentioned, this is a coast-wide salmon issue. And in the last few years, we have seen several significant steps towards addressing some of these big issues. We've seen dams breached elsewhere throughout the range of southern resident killer whales, most notably the Elwha River, which has just been this incredible recovery story that we can point to show, the real world proof that dam breaching is incredibly successful. We've seen much greater limits on fisheries as salmon runs have failed to recover. And perhaps most notably in the last 12 months or so, as we've seen in British Columbia, some significant efforts to start phasing out those fish farms that have been so detrimental to the Fraser River Chinook salmon runs. So both at state, provincial, and federal government levels, we've seen action in recent years to seriously address what's going on with Chinook salmon coast-wide. And it's a start. We all know that it's not enough yet, but it does really feel like the tide is starting to change, that we recognize that these actions need to be taken, and they need to be taken now or in the very near future, for wild Chinook salmon and the southern resident killer whales that depend on them to really have a chance to recover.